There's an engine that destroyed Ford's reputation so completely that the company is still recovering 15 years later. It was supposed to be revolutionary. It was supposed to save the company billions in development costs. Instead, it became the most catastrophic engineering failure in modern automotive history, costing Ford over $3 billion in warranty claims, recalls, and lawsuits. The engine that was designed to power Ford's future ended up nearly destroying the company. It's called the 6.0-liter Power-Stroke diesel, and if you know trucks, you just flinched reading that name. In 2003, Ford needed a new diesel engine for their Super Duty trucks. The previous engine, the 7.3-liter Power-Stroke, was bulletproof. Truck owners loved it. Fleet managers trusted it. The engine had a reputation for running 500,000 miles without major repairs. It was slow, loud, and got terrible fuel economy, but it never broke down. That was all that mattered. But here's what Ford decided. Instead of refining the 7.3, they'd replace it entirely with a modern design that made more power, got better fuel economy, and met new emission standards. They partnered with International Navistar to develop the 6.0-liter Power-Stroke. On paper, it was perfect. 325 horsepower, 560 pound-feet of torque, and significantly better emissions than the old engine. Variable geometry turbocharger for better response. High-pressure oil system for precise fuel injection. EGR cooling system to reduce emissions. Advanced electronics for better control. Everything a modern diesel should be. The engine launched in 2003 model year Super Duty trucks. After 50,000 miles, sometimes after 5,000 miles. And the failures were catastrophic. The first sign of trouble appeared within months. Truck owners started reporting white smoke from the exhaust, coolant loss, and overheating. The diagnosis was always the same. Blown head gaskets. In a diesel engine. Here's why this was insane. Diesel engines don't blow head gaskets. They're compression ignition engines with significantly more cylinder pressure than gasoline engines. Head gaskets are designed to handle that pressure for the life of the engine. A blown head gasket on a diesel with low mileage indicates fundamental design failure. But here's what made it worse. The head gasket failure wasn't isolated. It was epidemic. By 2005, thousands of 6.0 Power-Stroke owners were experiencing the same failure. Online forums filled with horror stories. Truck owners stranded on highways. Fleet vehicles down for weeks. Repair costs exceeding $3,000 per truck. The root cause was tragic, engineering stupidity. The 6.0 used head studs instead of head bolts. Bolts pull the head down and stretch slightly under pressure, which is good because it allows some movement. Studs are rigid. They don't flex. In the 6.0, the cylinder head would expand from heat, but the studs wouldn't. The head would lift slightly, the gasket would fail, and coolant would mix with oil. Ford knew about this problem within the first year. Their solution was to add more torque to the head studs during assembly, hoping increased clamping force would solve it. It didn't. The studs still didn't flex. The head still lifted, and the gaskets still failed. But Ford kept building engines this way for 4 more years. The financial damage was staggering. A head gasket replacement on a 6.0 Power-Stroke required removing the cab from the truck frame to access the engine. This was 8 hours of labor at $150 per hour, plus $1,500 in parts. Ford was paying these warranty claims on trucks with 30,000 miles. Multiply that by thousands of trucks and the warranty costs became astronomical. While head gaskets were failing, another catastrophic flaw emerged. The EGR cooler would fail, dumping coolant into the intake system, hydrolocking the engine and destroying it completely. This wasn't a repair. This was total engine replacement. Here's what an EGR cooler does. Exhaust gas recirculation takes hot exhaust gases and recirculates them back into the intake to reduce combustion temperatures and lower emissions. The EGR cooler uses engine coolant to cool the exhaust gases before they re-enter the engine. It's a heat exchanger sitting in a brutally hot environment with coolant on one side and 1,200-degree exhaust gases on the other. The 6.0 SEGR cooler was under-engineered from day one. The cooler consisted of thin stainless steel tubes surrounded by coolant. Under normal operation, these tubes would crack from thermal cycling, hot exhaust on the inside, cold coolant on the outside, constant expansion and contraction. The tubes would fail, coolant would leak into the exhaust side, and then get sucked into the intake manifold. But here's where it gets catastrophic. Diesel engines compress air to extreme pressures before fuel injection. If coolant enters the cylinders instead of air, the engine tries to compress liquid. Liquid doesn't compress. The connecting rods bend, pistons crack, and the engine destroys itself in seconds. This is called hydrolocking, and it's instantly fatal to engines. Truck owners would be driving normally. The EGR cooler would fail. Coolant would flood the intake, and the engine would seize at highway speed. The repair wasn't replacing the EGR cooler. At 50,000 miles, at Ford's warranty expense, the numbers became a nightmare. A replacement 6.0 Power Stroke engine cost $8,000 to $10,000 installed. Ford was replacing engines under warranty at this cost on trucks that were barely broken in. Fleet operators with 50 or 100 trucks were experiencing multiple total engine failures per year. The warranty expenses were destroying Ford's profits on the entire Super Duty line. As if head gaskets and EGR coolers weren't enough, the engine had a third catastrophic flaw. The oil cooler would fail, allowing coolant and oil to mix, which would then cause the EGR cooler to clog, which would cause the engine to overheat, which would blow the head gaskets. It was a cascading failure where one problem triggered three more. Here's the engineering stupidity. The 6.0 used engine oil to power the fuel injectors. This required oil pressure around 3,000 psi, which is insane. To achieve this, Ford used a high-pressure oil pump and a complex system of oil rails and passages. The oil cooler was integrated into this system, using engine coolant to cool the high-pressure oil. The oil cooler was another under-engineered heat exchanger. Thin metal plates separating high-pressure hot oil from pressurized coolant. When the plates would crack from thermal stress, oil and coolant would mix. This created a chocolate milk mixture that would clog the EGR cooler, reduce coolant flow, cause overheating, and blow head gaskets. But here's the truly maddening part. You couldn't see the oil cooler failing until it was too late. The coolant would slowly contaminate the oil over weeks. By the time the truck owner noticed anything wrong, the oil was already contaminated, the EGR was already clogging, and the engine was already overheating. The damage was done before symptoms appeared. The repair wasn't cheap. Replacing the oil cooler required 6 minutes 8 hours of labor because it was buried deep in the engine. And by the time you replaced the oil cooler, you usually had to replace the EGR cooler and head gaskets too because they'd already been damaged by the contamination and overheating. A truck with 40,000 miles was looking at $5,000 to $7,000 in repairs. The 6.0 had one more design flaw that made all the others worse. The fuel injectors would stick in their bores due to contamination in the high-pressure oil system. This caused rough running, hard starting, and eventually complete failure. But replacing all 8 injectors cost $4,000 in parts alone. Here's the mechanism. The 6.0 used HEI injectors, which stands for hydraulically actuated electronic unit injectors. Instead of using fuel pressure to open the injectors, they used high-pressure engine oil. When you pressed the accelerator, the computer would send a signal to release high-pressure oil to the injectors, which would force them open to spray fuel. This system was brilliant in theory and catastrophic in practice. The injectors had tight tolerances and required extremely clean oil to function. But remember, the oil cooler was failing and contaminating the oil with coolant. Contaminated oil would varnish the injector bores, causing them to stick. Stuck injectors wouldn't open properly, causing misfires and power loss. But here's what made it unforgivable. When injectors started sticking, Ford's solution was to replace all 8 injectors at $500 each, plus 8 years of labor. That's $4,000 in parts and $1,500 in labor. For injectors failing at 60,000 miles because Ford used a flawed oil cooling system that contaminated the oil that powered the injectors. Every failure traced back to Ford's original engineering decisions. Truck owners were facing $5,500 injector jobs on trucks that were barely paid off. Fleet operators were budgeting thousands of dollars per truck per year just for injector replacements. The 6.0 Power Stroke wasn't just unreliable, it was financially ruinous for anyone who owned one. The variable geometry turbocharger that was supposed to make the 6.0 so advanced became another failure point. The VGT used movable vanes inside the turbine housing to control boost pressure. These vanes were operated by an actuator that would carbon up and stick, causing turbo failure and loss of power. Here's why the VGT failed so consistently. The EGR system would recirculate exhaust gases that contained soot and carbon. These gases would pass through the turbocharger on their way back into the engine. The carbon would accumulate on the VGT vanes and actuator, causing them to stick. Stuck vanes meant the turbo couldn't regulate boost pressure, which caused overboost conditions and turbo failure. The repair was predictable and expensive. Replace the turbocharger at $2,500 to $3,500, but the turbo wasn't really the problem. The EGR system was. So unless you also fixed the EGR system, the new turbo would fail the same way in another 50,000 miles. Owners were replacing turbos every 60,000 to 80,000 miles on an engine that should have turbos lasting 300,000 miles. Here's what made the 6.0 Power Stroke uniquely catastrophic. Each failure caused other failures. The oil cooler would fail, contaminating the oil. Contaminated oil would clog the EGR cooler. Clogged EGR would cause overheating. Overheating would blow head gaskets. Blown head gaskets would pressurize the cooling system. Pressurized cooling system would blow the oil cooler again. It was a death spiral where fixing one problem didn't prevent the others. Truck owners would spend $3,000 fixing head gaskets. 6 months later, the EGR cooler would fail, costing another $2,000. 6 months after that, the oil cooler would fail, costing $1,500. Then the injectors would stick from contaminated oil, costing $5,500. In 2 years, owners would spend $12,000 in repairs on a truck with 100,000 miles. But here's the truly insane part. The truck still wasn't reliable. Because the fundamental design flaws remained. You didn't fix a 6.0 Power Stroke. You managed its continuous failures until you finally gave up and sold it to someone who didn't know better. By 2007, Ford's warranty costs for the 6.0 Power Stroke exceeded $1 billion. But that's just the direct costs. The indirect costs were far worse. Truck buyers who got burned by the 6.0 switched to Dodge Cummins or Chevy Duramax and never came back. Fleet managers who experienced downtime and repair costs abandoned Ford entirely. The brand's reputation in the heavy-duty truck market was destroyed. The numbers tell the story. In 2003, Ford had 42% of the heavy-duty truck market. By 2010, it had dropped to 33%. They lost nearly 10 percentage points of market share in 7 years. That's billions in lost revenue. And it's directly attributable to one engine. The resale values collapsed. A 2005 Super Duty with a 6.0 Power Stroke that cost $45,000 new was worth $12,000 with 100,000 miles in 2010. The same year Dodge with a Cummins or Chevy with a Duramax was worth $22,000 to $25,000. The 6.0 trucks lost value so fast that owners were underwater on loans within 3 years. They couldn't sell without taking massive losses. But here's what makes it unforgivable. Ford knew. Internal documents from lawsuits show Ford engineers documented these problems in 2003 and 2004. They knew the head gaskets were failing. They knew the EGR coolers were failing. They knew the oil coolers were failing, and they kept building the engine anyway for 4 more model years. They chose profit over reputation. The most damning evidence of Ford's engineering failure is what the aftermarket had to do to make the engine reliable. Companies like Bulletproof Diesel and XDP developed comprehensive fix kits that addressed every design flaw Ford ignored. Here's what the aftermarket did. They replaced the head studs with ARP studs that could handle the clamping loads. They installed upgraded EGR coolers with thicker stainless steel that wouldn't crack. They added oil coolers with larger capacity and better construction. They installed coolant filtration systems to prevent contamination. They upgraded the turbos with better actuators that wouldn't carbon up. The cost for a complete bulletproofing kit is $4,000 to $6,000 in parts, plus $2,000 to $3,000 in labor. So $7,000 to $9,000 total to fix what Ford should have built correctly from the factory. And after bulletproofing, the 6.0 Power Stroke becomes reliable. The engines run 300,000 miles without major problems when the design flaws are corrected. But here's what this proves. The aftermarket fixed the engine using better quality parts and improved designs. This means Ford could have built it correctly from the beginning. They chose not to. They chose to use cheaper materials, inadequate designs, and insufficient testing. The aftermarket proved Ford's engineering was deficient by showing what the engine should have been. The 6.0 Power Stroke was produced from 2003 to 2007. In those 5 years, Ford built approximately 1.2 million engines. Nearly all of them experienced at least one major failure. Many experienced multiple failures. The warranty costs exceeded $3 billion when you include engine replacements, repeated repairs, and settlements from class action lawsuits. But the reputational damage was far worse. Ford's heavy-duty truck reputation went from bulletproof in 2002 to don't buy Ford diesels by 2008. That reputation persists today. Truck buyers in 2025 still reference the 6.0 as why they won't buy Ford diesels. The current 6.7 Power Stroke is actually reliable, but buyers don't trust it because of what happened 20 years ago. Here's what Ford lost. Market share that took decades to build. Gone in 5 years. Customer loyalty that defined their truck brand. Destroyed. The premium pricing they commanded for Super Duty trucks. Eliminated because buyers wouldn't pay Ford prices after the 6.0 disaster. They traded short-term profit from using cheaper components for long-term devastation of their most important product line. The 6.0 Power Stroke failed because Ford made every wrong decision at every stage. They chose to partner with International Navistar instead of developing in-house. They rushed the engine to production to meet emissions deadlines. They used inadequate components to save money. They ignored testing data showing problems. They continued production after failures appeared. And they fought warranty claims instead of fixing the design. But here's the fundamental failure. Ford forgot what made the 7.3 Power Stroke successful. It was overbuilt, simple, and reliable. The 6.0 was the opposite. It was optimized for cost reduction, complicated with failure-prone emissions equipment, and fragile. Ford tried to engineer excellence on a budget and created catastrophe instead. The 6.0 Power Stroke destroyed Ford's diesel reputation so thoroughly that the company is still recovering 15 years after production ended. It cost them billions in warranty expenses, billions more in lost sales, and damaged their brand in ways that persist to this day. It remains the textbook example of how one catastrophically bad engine can destroy a company's reputation in the market segment that matters most. Ford tried to save money on engineering. Instead, they created the most expensive engine failure in automotive history.